The biggest hole in a world where Europe never reaches the Americas is not the United States. It is dinner. No potato in Ireland, no tomato in Italy, no chili in India, and no chocolate anywhere on the planet. That sounds like a party trick, and it isn't. The point of running this counterfactual properly is that the loss of America to European maps is the smallest consequence on the list. Take away sustained contact after 1492, and you take away the exchange system that welded 4 continents into one economy. Silver moving east, crops moving everywhere, diseases moving west, and African people forced onto ships by the millions to work land that, in this version, Europe never owns. So let's do it seriously. Not a fantasy map with a big Aztec superpower stamped across Mexico. A world where the mechanism is missing, and we follow what breaks. Start where the question actually starts. In 1492, the Americas are not empty and not waiting. There is a city in the middle of a lake in the Valley of Mexico, fed by chinampas, artificial garden islands built out into shallow water, and enough of that engineered water country survives at Xochimilco that UNESCO lists it as evidence of what it took to build a productive habitat in a hard lacustrine environment. Down the spine of South America, there is a road system running more than 20,000 miles, over mountain passes, across deserts, down into tropical lowland, tying administrative centres to villages. Walk it and you would hear llama trains, feet on stone, storehouse clerks counting. None of that is a preview of something, it is the thing itself. Now, the title. America was never discovered is a phrase that quietly assumes nobody was home. Millions of people were home. What the word discovered actually means in practice is that Europeans folded 2 continents into their own maps, their own diplomacy, their own trade. The honest version of the question is narrower and better. What if Europe never established lasting contact with the Americas after 1492? Even that needs rules, because Europeans had already been there. Norse sailors were at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland in 1021, dated precisely, and the occupation was short and led nowhere. There is also evidence of contact between Polynesian and South American populations before any European sailed west. Contact happened. Contact kept not sticking. That's the distinction the entire scenario rests on. Reaching a place is trivial compared to building a permanent bridge to it. Which brings up the obvious objection, so let's kill it early. Getting rid of Columbus does not get rid of 1492. Erase him and some other Iberian, English, French or Portuguese expedition sails west within a decade or 2. Because the ships existed, the money existed, and the appetite existed. Once several old world societies have blue water hulls, large states, and a commercial reason to gamble, repeated oceanic contact stops being an accident and starts being a schedule. Norse crews had already crossed the North Atlantic. Polynesian navigators were crossing distances that make the Atlantic look like a canal. And by the 18th century, the Russians are coming at the problem from the other side entirely. With Bering's 1741 voyage putting Alaska into the Russian imperial system. So the rule for this scenario is stronger than one dead sailor. Columbus's project fails and leaves nothing behind. No reliable return route, no usable map, no profitable precedent that makes the next investor say yes. The voyages that follow either fail, stay secret, or touch land and vanish, without seeding a colony, an epidemic chain, or a trade route. The Norse settlement remains what it really was, a dead end. Polynesian and Bering Strait contacts continue at a local scale without turning into a hemispheric merger. Everything else in world history proceeds under normal pressure. Kings still fight, merchants still hunt for routes, technologies still travel, and the weather still changes. Give the Americas that gap and the first thing that doesn't happen is the dying. That is the largest single difference, and it isn't close. In real history, pathogens arriving from Europe and Africa did not act alone. They landed on top of warfare, forced labour, famine, displacement, and colonial resettlement policies, and the combination produced one of the worst population collapses anyone has recorded. The pre-contact numbers are argued over, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Scholarship generally puts the population of the Americas in 1492 in the tens of millions, and the decline by the middle of the 17th century at an enormous scale. The argument is about how many. Nobody serious argues about whether. Remove sustained contact and there is no continent-wide wave of smallpox, measles and influenza on that schedule. Local epidemics still happen, harvests still fail, cities still get sick. What doesn't happen is a disease front arriving in front of an invading army, hollowing out a state's administration before the fighting even begins, and leaving a political vacuum that a few hundred foreigners with allies can walk into. The Caribbean is the first place you see the difference, because in real history it was the first place to be broken. Taíno and other island societies stay in play here as the actors they were: traders, sailors, rivals across a busy sea. Bigger islands could build stronger federations or maritime states, and because islands are always the first thing a foreign ship reaches, they end up being the hinge later, whether as gateways, quarantine stations, or the places the shooting starts. Mesoamerica is where people's imaginations tend to go wrong. The Mexica-led Triple Alliance did not run a happy empire. It ran a tributary system out of Tenochtitlan that plenty of its subjects hated, and Tlaxcala, sitting right there, never accepted it at all. Tributary towns rebelled, succession was a knife fight, and ecological pressure on the lake basin was real. So the plausible outcome without Spanish intervention is not eternal Mexica rule, and not a scheduled collapse either. It's a long grinding cycle of coalition wars and hegemonic states replacing each other, the way most tributary systems in most of the world actually behaved. The difference that matters is who is doing the fighting. All that conflict stays internal. No outsider shows up with steel weapons, ocean-going ships, interpreters, disaffected local allies and an epidemic, all at the same moment. Take away any one of those ingredients and Cortés is a footnote. Take away all of them and a fractured Mesoamerica is still a very expensive place to invade. The Andes are the more interesting case, and I want to sit here a while. Tawantinsuyu had structural problems that had nothing to do with Europe. Succession fights, elite factions, provinces that resented the centre, and the sheer difficulty of governing terrain that runs from coastal desert to high puna to jungle. Civil war was possible. Civil war was arguably likely. What was not likely was civil war turning into colonial conquest, because that conversion required a foreign force capturing the emperor while disease was already killing the men who might have replaced him. Without that, a winner reunifies the empire, or rival branches harden into successor kingdoms, or the frontier provinces walk away and the road network becomes a trade artery between rivals instead of a spine of one state. Any of those is fine. All of them keep the underlying machinery. The roads, the storehouses, the labour obligations, the record keeping, the ability to move food and men across 1,000 miles of vertical country. That capacity is the thing colonial history erased, and in this version, it compounds for another 250 years. Their weakness is easy to name and doesn't go away. No gunpowder and no deep-water navy. Andean metalworking was technically sophisticated, gold and copper alloys handled with real skill, but it went into ornament, ritual and status rather than into weapon systems, and no amount of goodwill turns that into artillery on its own. North America is where the honest answer is the least satisfying. It was politically diverse, and it stays that way. Cahokia had already peaked centuries before 1492. A city UNESCO puts at roughly 10 to 20,000 people at its height, across ground comparable to a substantial medieval town, and its decline did not delete the farming, trade and political habits of the Mississippi Valley. Those continue. Confederacies keep building, river trade keeps running, farm towns keep expanding along the bottomlands. What changes is the absence of the two objects that rewrote the continent in real history: the horse and the gun. Whole nations rose in the 17th and 18th centuries because they got mounted first, or armed first, or both. None of that happens. The plainstayer bison country worked on foot and by dog travois, which is a different world, not a smaller one. And it is not defensible to draw one big continental empire across the map and call it analysis. Larger federations in the northeast, the Mississippi Basin, the southwest and the Pacific Northwest are plausible. Anything more precise is fan fiction. One more thing about the Americas before we cross the ocean, because it gets sanitized constantly. This is not a utopia. War, hierarchy, coerced labour and ecological stress all continue, and states still fall apart on their own. The difference is not that the crises stop. The difference is that the crises stay theirs and don't get converted into somebody else's settler empire. Now Europe, which loses less than the internet thinks and more than it would like. Spain is the clearest case. Spain is still a serious monarchy, with Iberian manpower, Mediterranean commitments, dynastic marriages, and armies that know their business. What Spain does not get is the bullion. Potosí and the northern Mexican mines fed Spanish finance and Spanish wars, and the Habsburgs spent that bullion as fast as it landed on Italy, on the Low Countries, on Central Europe. Take the mines out and the wars get shorter or smaller, or simply don't get fought. The pressure on France eases. The Dutch revolt runs differently. The balance inside the Holy Roman Empire shifts. And the 16th century price revolution, the long inflation that silver helped to drive across Europe, is muted. Which way that cuts is not something I can tell you, and neither can anyone else. A poorer Spain is a weaker Spain, and a weaker Spain means somebody else is stronger. The direction is solid. The winners are guesswork. Portugal does the most obvious thing available. It doubles down on what it already had. The route around Africa exists. The Indian Ocean ports exist. The spice money exists. So merchants and the crown push harder east. The catch is that Portugal without Brazil is a narrower empire, no sugar, no later gold, no plantation wealth to cushion it. And that makes it more exposed when the Dutch arrive, when the Ottomans push, when Asian powers decide they've had enough. England, France and the Netherlands lose their western frontier entirely. No settler colonies, no sugar islands, no tobacco zones, no cod stations, no continental land market to sell to farmers. Liverpool, Bristol, Bordeaux, Nantes and Amsterdam all grow along some other curve. Their merchants shove instead into the Baltic, the Mediterranean, Africa and Asia, where the competition is older and harder. There is research arguing that Atlantic trade and colonial profit did more than enrich these countries. Under certain political conditions, it strengthened merchant groups who then pushed for institutional change at home, and that this is part of why the Atlantic-facing states pulled ahead. Cut the channel, and northwestern Europe may still rise. The lead is probably smaller, and it arrives later. The Reformation happens anyway, and I want to be blunt about that because people love to make 1492 the hinge of everything. Printing exists, church finance is already rotten, and the German princes are already rivals. Humanism is already corroding old authority. Luther nails his argument to the door in 1517 in this world too. What changes is the money, and the geopolitics wrapped around the wars of religion, because a poorer Spain, a different Dutch economy and altered French finances change how long those wars last and who wins them. Then there's the industrial question, where I'm going to disappoint anyone hoping for a clean answer. Britain still has coal. Britain still has navigable rivers and canals, skilled trades, scientific societies, an agricultural revolution of its own and dense commercial links to Europe and Asia. Industrialization had more than one cause, and it is lazy to pretend America was the only one. What disappears is a set of accelerants: American cotton, colonial markets, Atlantic shipping volume, and the population growth that American crops paid for. The defensible answer is that the breakthrough is delayed or relocated. Maybe Britain still gets there, slower. Maybe the Netherlands or France or Northern Italy or Germany stays close enough to make it a race. Maybe Japan, India or China is in the running rather than a century behind. A global industrial age still shows up. It just doesn't automatically arrive wearing a Union Jack. Politically, the dominoes go strange. No American Revolution, obviously, because there is no America to revolt, no republic across the water to serve as an example and later as an ally. France skips the cost of intervening in that war, though France still has a rotten tax system, a locked social hierarchy and old war debts stacked up, so a French Revolution can still happen. The trigger, the date, and the international shape of it all move. No Spanish-American independence wars, no Haitian Revolution. Those events do not get postponed, they stop existing. Africa is where this counterfactual stops being an intellectual exercise and starts being about human beings. The Atlantic slave trade was not an automatic consequence of Europeans reaching West Africa. Europeans reached West Africa decades before they reached the Caribbean. What made the traffic monstrous was demand. Mines and plantations in the Americas, above all the sugar zones of Brazil and the Caribbean, consuming labour faster than it could be replaced. Historical databases put the number forced onto Atlantic slave ships at roughly 12.5 million, with about 10.6 million surviving the Middle Passage. The destination pattern is the tell. The Caribbean and South America absorbed the overwhelming majority of the people who arrived alive, and Brazil alone accounts for something like 2/5 of the entire trade. Take away the plantations and there is no destination. Nothing else in the Atlantic world could absorb millions of coerced labourers across 4 centuries. Some trafficking to islands, to Europe, to European posts in Africa may still happen. The system, the industrial-scale 400-year machine, does not exist. Of every conclusion in this whole scenario, that one is the most causally secure, which is not the same as saying Africa becomes free. Slavery and coerced labour existed in African, Mediterranean, Islamic and Indian Ocean societies before 1492 and would have continued after it. Rulers still raid, captives still get sold. What vanishes is a colossal external demand shock, not human cruelty. The knock-on effects run in both directions, and this is where I'll resist the tidy version. Congo, the Bight of Benin, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Biafra, West Central Africa. These regions were reshaped by Atlantic demand, and without it they faced different incentives. Less access to imported firearms, fewer wars fought to produce captives. Some states that historically rose on slave exports never rise at all. Population losses, gender imbalances, displacement, and the long corrosion of trust between neighbours are all reduced. Coastal commercial states lean harder into gold, textiles, ivory, pepper, and regional trade. The countervailing risk is real, and worth stating plainly. European powers denied American land and American wealth have to look somewhere, and Africa is close. Pressure on the coasts could arrive earlier and harder than it did in reality. This is not a scenario where Africa gets left alone. It's a scenario where Africa gets a different fight. And there's a loss on the other side of the ledger that people rarely say out loud because it feels awkward. No transatlantic slave trade means no African diaspora in the Americas. No Haitian Revolution. No African-American history in any form you would recognize. No Afro-Brazilian majority regions. No Creole cultures forged out of African, Indigenous and European material. The music alone, gone. The religions, languages, cooking, political movements that came out of those communities, all of it built on top of atrocity and none of it existing without the atrocity. The suffering is prevented. So is everything the survivors made. Both are true and the second one does not soften the first. Now the part that decides whether this whole thing is a fun what-if or a serious argument. Asia? American silver was a currency, and I mean that structurally. Potosí and the Mexican mines expanded the world's bullion supply, and the Manila galleons carried that silver across the Pacific into Chinese markets that wanted it badly enough to set the profitability of mines on the other side of the planet. That circuit tied Spanish America, Europe and East Asia into one monetary system. Pull the mines and the circuit collapses before it forms. Global trade doesn't stop. Japan was a major silver producer in its own right, and Asian merchants had sophisticated credit and commodity systems that predated any Spaniard. What changes is volume, geography and monetary integration, how much money there is, where it moves, and how tightly Europe and Asia are financially fused. Ming and Qing fiscal history bends. European access to Asian goods gets more expensive. Spanish imperial power never inflates in the first place. The Philippines drop out of the Spanish story altogether. That conquest ran through Mexico. Without a Mexican base and without silver to pay for the crossing, the Manila galleon system has no reason to exist. The archipelago stays oriented toward Brunei, Chinese maritime trade and the Muslim sultanates, with the Dutch or Portuguese possibly muscling in later. Some other power might dominate. Possibly no single power does. Then the crops, which are the part of this story I find genuinely hard to hold in my head at full size. The Columbian exchange carried potatoes, maize, cassava, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, peanuts, and cacao into Afro-Eurasia, and these were not garnishes. They were calories in places where existing staples struggled. Potatoes grew in cold, wet soil that grain hated. Cassava tolerated drought that killed everything else. Maize slotted into rotations across Africa, Europe and Asia. Sweet potatoes and maize let Chinese farmers push into uplands and thin soils that had been agriculturally marginal for millennia. Economic research finds that the potato alone made a substantial contribution to Old World population growth and urbanization in the 18th and 19th centuries. Read that sentence again slowly, because it means a tuber from the Andes is partly responsible for how many Europeans there are. Without those crops, Europe, China, and much of Africa are less populous by the 19th century. How much less, nobody can honestly calculate, because farmers are not passive. They substitute, they improve techniques, they migrate, they change what they eat. Food output in the marginal environments is still lower, which means fewer people in the towns and less tax in the treasury. And a Europe with fewer mouths and no western frontier for its surplus population has to push its pressure somewhere. So Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, Africa, and Asia all feel it more. The dinner table is the version of this that lands, which is why I open there. Ireland and Northern Europe lean harder on grain, dairy, and turnips, with a completely different curve of rural population growth and famine risk. Italy has no tomato, so no pasta sauce and no pizza as anyone knows it, and polenta stays whatever grain it was before maize arrived. Indian and Southeast Asian cooking builds heat out of black pepper, long pepper, and ginger instead of chili, which is a genuinely different sensation on the tongue. Chinese regional cuisines lose sweet potato, maize, peanuts, and chili. West and Central African kitchens run on yams, millet, sorghum, rice, and plantains, carrying the whole load without cassava or maize. There is no chocolate industry. There is no vanilla industry. Half the flavours you think of as ancient and national are 400 years old and came from a hemisphere Europe supposedly discovered. Biology goes the other way too and stays home. No horses arrive, so the plains never become horse country, and the mounted cultures of the 18th and 19th centuries never form. No cattle, sheep, or pigs on the historical schedule, so no ranching frontier grinds through Mexico, the Pampas, or the western half of North America. Llamas and alpacas remain the largest domestic transport animals in the hemisphere, which caps how much weight moves how far and quietly caps a great deal else. No sugar and coffee and cotton belt clears the tropical forests, reorganises the rivers and imports a labour system to run it. Indigenous land management continues instead. Urban farming, controlled burning, forest cultivation, the same practices that LIDAR surveys keep turning up under the Amazon canopy, where researchers now think more than 10,000 pre-Columbian earthworks are still sitting undiscovered. On climate, I'm going to be careful, because this is where alternate history gets sloppy. Some researchers have argued that post-1492 depopulation abandoned so much farmland and regrew so much forest that the carbon uptake nudged atmospheric carbon dioxide and global temperature. Later work pushes back, pointing out that vegetation responded very unevenly by region, and that pinning a temperature change on it is not settled. The defensible statement is narrow. A no-contact America keeps more of its ground actively farmed and managed, so the specific reforestation pulse tied to depopulation never happens. Anyone telling you this cancels the Little Ice Age is selling something. Which leaves the question I've been putting off. How long can this last? Not forever. That's the honest answer, and it's the one that makes the scenario interesting rather than childish. Ships get better, states get hungrier, and somebody eventually crosses and stays. The real question is not whether contact happens, it's when and from which direction, and what the Americas look like on the day it does. If contact comes around 1600, roughly a century late, the world is barely rearranged. Indigenous populations are intact and states are stronger, so conquest gets expensive and alliances are less decisive and settlement is slow. Medicine, though, is still garbage. Once regular traffic starts, epidemic disease still tears through, because germ theory is 2.5 centuries away. The crops, the silver, the slave trade all still arrive, they just arrive late. It's a delay, not a divergence. If contact waits until roughly 1900, you get something almost unimaginable and almost impossible. Steamships, telegraphs, modern artillery and modern medicine confront populous, organised, industrializing by imitation American states. The biology is manageable by then. The military asymmetry is grotesque. There's no demographic vacuum for settlers to pour into, so the Americas end up resembling 19th century Asia. Unequal treaties, treaty ports, spheres of influence, humiliation without replacement. It's a compelling picture, and I don't believe it for a second. Keeping two hemispheres apart for 400 years requires either different geography or an author with his thumb on the scale. The version that actually works sits in the middle, around 1750, and it works because history hands us the route for free. The Russians were already coming. Bering's 1741 voyage confirmed Alaska to the Russian imperial system in our world, and in this one the Atlantic stays closed while the North Pacific opens. So the first durable bridge between the hemispheres is not a fleet of caravels in the Caribbean, it's fur traders and naval officers, working down from the Bering region through indigenous trading networks who mediate contact on their own terms because they are the ones who know the coast. Look at the timing. By 1750, Eurasia has stronger gunpowder states than it did in 1500, which is bad news. It also has, within 50 years, smallpox vaccination, which is the single most important date in this entire scenario. Not a guarantee. A tool, and only if the powers holding it bother to use it. Measles and influenza remain lethal regardless. And on the American side, 2.5 additional centuries have happened. Population growth, political consolidation, technological drift, states that have had time to become states. That changes the shape of contact. It could open as regulated trade instead of immediate conquest. Coastal powers control who lands, where, and how often. They buy weapons, they buy shipwrights, they demand vaccination and quarantine as terms of any treaty, which turns medicine into a diplomatic instrument rather than a passive catastrophe. They play Eurasian rivals against one another the way other states have done when they had something to bargain with, and no illusions. Britain, Russia, the Netherlands, Japan and Chinese merchants all want access to 2 continents nobody has mapped, and every one of them is available to be played against the others. Does it hold? Partly. Industrial powers force concessions and treaty ports somewhere on the coasts in the 19th century, because that's what industrial powers do. Populous inland states are a different proposition, and mass settler replacement needs an empty country to settle, which this one refuses to be. So here's the world you wake up in. There is no single America. The hemisphere holds dozens of states, imperial successors and federations and maritime republics, thickest in Mesoamerica and the Andes, because those were the places already carrying big political infrastructure in 1492. Spain and Portugal are ordinary European countries. There is no Washington-led order, no Monroe Doctrine, no dollar reserve system. World population is lower because Afro-Eurasia never got the crops. English is a regional language, and the ones you would actually need for business are Nahuatl, Quechua, Aymara, the Maya languages, Guarani. And the thing to hold on to is this. America was never the missing continent. It was always there, farmed, roaded, governed and fought over. What went missing in this scenario is the event, the collision that fused 2 biospheres and 4 continents into one system in a single lifetime, and paid for it with the worst demographic catastrophe on record and 12.5 million people in chains. Every potato in Ireland and every silver coin in Canton was part of the receipt.